We gather this morning on the 11th day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Along with the rest of the world, I've been watching the tragedy unfold, trying to make sense of it all. I'm no scholar on international relations, nor a historian, and I'm sure many of you could actually explain the details of this better than I could, so that's not what I'm setting out to do this morning. I'm not going to outline how this Russian aggression is just the newest escalation in a war that actually started in 2014. I'm not going to share the stories of Ukrainian bravery, amazing though they are, showing the world what actual patriotism looks like. I'm not going to point to all the ways this war is already impacting the economy, making things even harder for those who already survive on not enough. But what I will do is help frame a way to approach the ills of the world that demand our attention and care as we lean into the work of justice. With this and with any complex situation, there are going to be immediate impacts, and there are going to be ripples that accumulate over time. The immediate impacts are generally felt by the people with the least amount of power to change the situation. These would be the people on the margins. According to authors Wu and Webster, marginalization refers to the process through which particular social groups obtain lower status and become peripheral in a society. The concept is related to poverty, but marginalization emphasizes the dynamics of a downward social trajectory rather than current living standards. The term also emphasizes external and often structural forces, such as the changing labor market, that exert influence on the social status of a group or people. Thus, marginalization refers to broad social processes by which social groups are becoming more unequal. So when there's a change to the balance of society, we can look to the margins to gauge the negative impact. If the people without the power to address the impact are struggling, it would behoove the rest of society to make an effort to support them, and here's why. Those with more power have the ability to cushion themselves for a while, hoping to ride it out until the waves calm down and things return to normal. As those buffering resources run out, wider circles of people are impacted by the situation over time, until eventually the buffers are gone entirely and the situation has escalated into a crisis that impacts everyone. This is what happens when the impact of the original situation has moved from the margins to the center of society. And we see this with crises of all kinds, all over the world. So it makes sense that in the work of justice, in the work of policymaking, in the work of law enforcement, in the work of urban planning, in the work of voting rights, it makes sense to look to the margins to gain an understanding of how any plan or action will impact the most vulnerable immediately. And once we understand the impact it will have, we can forecast down the road that eventually that impact will reach everyone in society. Let's take a very small example. A few days ago, Andrea Roski-Metcalf shared a story online about her 8-year-old daughter, Clementine, who came home from school this week and asked urgently to have supplies for a small art project. She made a pair of peace mats, 2 pieces of paper that would sit on the ground and offer a spot for 2 people to sit down when they're embroiled in a conflict. She'd learned the idea from her 2nd grade teacher. When 2 kids in their 2nd grade class would get into a disagreement or someone had their feelings hurt, they give the peace pass to the classmate with whom they're in a conflict as an invitation to sit together on the rug and go through these steps. First, arrive calm. Second, explain what happened without blaming. Say, when that happened, I felt blank. In the future, please, blank. To feel better, I need blank. And lastly, agree on the solution. The author thought that it was cute and touching that their classroom did this and that her daughter wanted to make peace mats at home, but then she witnessed something amazing. She wrote, "Tonight after dinner, when my husband was out and I was doing bedtime alone with the girls, I was just done. I needed my kids to be in bed. They were supposed to be on their way there when I could hear them getting into some little spat over which books were whose, and I was over it. I went upstairs to fold clothes in the hopes that they could work it out on their own. I came back downstairs a few minutes later, expecting them to find them still arguing or each in her own room with a sour attitude, but instead, I found them on the living room rug, sitting crisscross applesauce, facing each other. What are you girls doing? I asked. I was kind of exasperated about it. You're supposed to be in bed. We're using the peace pass, Clem said. Her tone was basically, duh, Mom. I let them be. And after just a few more minutes, they were laughing together. And then they headed into their bedrooms. Wait, that's it? I asked. You're all done arguing? They were. And I didn't have to get involved, and you're not all crabby about it? They were not. It was like magic, she writes. I've been parenting for nearly 12 years, and I feel like I leveled up tonight, but I didn't have a darn thing to do about it. This was entirely Clementine's teacher, modeling conflict management in a classroom full of 7- and 8-year-old children. She concludes, the world is on fire. In some ways, it always has been, but tonight, actual nuclear power plants are burning because grown-up leaders who are drunk on power never had an elementary school teacher take the time to sit them down and teach them how to work through their feelings. So imagine what our world could be like if everyone in our society had learned to use peace rugs when they were children. Imagine if those skills were prerequisites for holding power. Imagine the impact that would have on the most marginalized reaches of our communities. Rebecca C. Burwell is a faculty member at Chicago Semester, where she teaches courses in race, social justice, and vocation. And I'll be quoting her extensively for a few minutes here. She writes, in 1942, during the Second World War, British academic William Beveridge developed a report entitled Social Insurance and Allied Services that identified 5 social issues that the British government would need to address once the war was over. These challenges included, quote, squalor, ignorance, want, idleness, and disease, end quote. In short, Beveridge's report was a call for concerted government action to rebuild the infrastructure and opportunities for British families to succeed after the devastation of the war. Though he did not know it at the time, Beveridge's report would become the vision for a post-war British society. His report is significant because he understood what many researchers and social scientists studying the intractable issue of poverty in the United States have finally come to understand, that poverty is a part of a broader constellation of issues that make disadvantage multidimensional. Poverty, understood too narrowly as just a lack of money or income, only examines one piece of the complex problems facing low-income families. Thus, any society that wants to address poverty will have to also examine the 5 evils Beveridge identified and their analogs today. Squalor would be housing, ignorance would be universal education, want would be income for the poor, idleness would be full employment, and disease would be healthcare. In a 2016 report by the Brookings Institution, 5 Evils, Multidimensional Poverty and Race in America, Richard Reeves, Elizabeth Kneebone, and Edward Rodriguez delve into how these 5 dimensions of disadvantage cluster in various ways to marginalize families, and in particular, families of color, so acutely. The job of researchers, policy experts, and other institutions that are trying to address poverty is to see how these dimensions overlap and to decluster them in a way that makes social mobility more of a reality for people living in poverty. The dimensions of inequality and poverty make social mobility difficult for families living on the margins. Some of the mechanisms that make poverty and inequality so intractable for economically vulnerable families living in the US include the patterns of eviction and housing dislocation. Obtaining affordable housing has been a growing problem in the US. On average, poor Americans spend half their income on rent. And in fact, about 1 in 4 poor Americans spends about 70% of their income on housing. Looking at the private rental market in which many low-income families find housing, sociologist Matthew Desmond found some disturbing trends. Formal and informal evictions in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, between the years 2009 and 2011, forced roughly 1 in 8 of the city's residents to move. In a city of over 600,000, with only 105,000 renting households, Milwaukee's landlords evict approximately 16,000 adults and children a year, which is roughly 16 families a day. For decades, we've focused on addressing poverty in the US by tackling issues related to living wage jobs, workforce development, the stress of single parenthood, and the lack of access to quality education for all communities. However, Desmond reminds us that we have not fully appreciated the extent to which issues around housing are deeply implicated in the creation and maintenance of poverty. Dr. Burwell goes on to ponder the question of what role faith communities have in challenging poverty and inequality. She writes, as a Christian scholar myself, I was compelled to think about my own responsibilities as a person of faith to addressing the trials faced by families living on the margins. How do faith communities respond to and challenge unjust systems? Where do we continue to fall short in these matters? One concept I keep returning to, she says, is Desmond's premise that we cannot just explore poverty and housing issues by examining only individual or structural systemic level explanations for people's lack of housing and experiences of vulnerability. He names these relationships as exploitative and calls the reader to examine the connections between families that are poor and those that are economically comfortable and indeed well off. And so this has obliged me to examine that if I am of the comfortable class, what is my role in maintaining these unequal relationships? End quote. I'd like to conclude with some reflections shared in the 1997 summer-fall volume of Religious Humanism, in which Jeffrey Kovac published an essay titled The Weapons of Privilege, and I'll be reading a few excerpts here. He writes, with privilege comes power. The power of money, the power of education, the power of social status. Power itself is neutral and can be used for good or evil. Used to injure and abuse other people, the power that comes from privilege becomes a weapon, as deadly to the human spirit as a firearm is to the body. Privilege leads us into patterns of behavior that dehumanize those with whom we share life's challenging vagaries. These are the weapons of privilege. The weapons of privilege are at the heart of the essential conflicts of American society, the conflicts that divide people. They are the basis of unequal power relationships, both explicit and implicit. Renouncing them is the key to a truly moral or religious life. I have identified a few, he writes. A first is the presumption that there are jobs that are beneath you. People with money or power or education often forget that all work is important. Even the most humble job contributes to the common good. Work is crucial to every person's dignity. The fact that my job as a college professor requires a higher education doesn't necessarily mean that is more important than weekly garbage collection. In fact, a garbage collector's strike has much more serious consequences than a college professor's strike, particularly in the heat of summer. I'm a pretty good cook, but I doubt that I would last a day as a short order chef in a popular lunch establishment. Even the best home cook can admire the skills of a good short order cook. A second weapon of privilege is the assumption that we cannot learn something from everyone we meet. Using superior rhetorical skills to destroy another person's argument before listening to see if it has value is a weapon often wielded by the educated. But not to listen is to dehumanize. On a personal level as well, assuming that a person has nothing to teach us has several consequences. First, there's much that we fail to learn. We can only discover the full diversity of human experience by listening to as many stories as possible. Each can broaden our perspective. Second, when we feel that there's nothing we can learn, we stop listening and therefore shut off any human relationship with the other person. Third, an illegitimate power relationship is established with one person on the top. Unequal, powerful relationships often lead to exploitation. It's not just that the work, pay, and credit are unequally shared, but that they are often unfairly shared with the powerless person receiving less of the pay and credit than their contribution warrants. A third weapon of privilege is abusing the essential inequality of giving. It is important to give of our talents, but we must remember that giving can set up an unequal power relationship. A gift given with arrogance demeans the other person. Too often, the privileged bring in their own preconceptions along with their gifts. They don't listen to the people they are trying to serve. And so service degenerates into patronage, which is a euphemism for the weapons that maintain the system of inequality. We can give up this weapon of privilege if we always remember the iron rule of the organizer: never do for people what they can do for themselves. The development of talent through application of the iron rule is crucial to the common good. As people gain new skills, they can use them not only to help themselves, but to help build a better community. We should look at people as potential contributors to be nurtured and not as mere recipients of services. A fourth weapon of privilege is acting without being concerned about the reaction. A powerful person can order subordinates to do pretty much anything, using essentially any language. They assume that the order will be carried out. It is of no concern that the language they use might be offensive or insulting. Since the powerful person controls their jobs or some other aspect of their lives, such as housing or schools, the public reaction must be subservient, no matter what they feel inside. If there's a negative reaction, the subordinate can be ignored or dismissed. Because it denies the essential humanity of the other person, language is perhaps the most powerful of the weapons of privilege. It is the hardest to lay down because it requires the inner strength and security to treat everyone as an equal and constant vigilance to make sure that our actions and words do not provoke undesirable reactions, such as defensiveness, shame, humiliation, or rage. The weapons of privilege are subtle, but powerful. They serve to perpetuate unequal power relationships between people, devaluing one individual or group at the expense of another. Devaluing another person's work, refusing to learn from others, abusing the spirit of charity, and acting without concern for others' reactions all come quite naturally. Sometimes the intention is to hurt or put down another person. Sometimes the motivation is completely benign. The effect, however, is usually the same. Since the behavior is so natural, it is difficult to change. We must change, however, if we are ever to eliminate the destructive differences that divide our society. The weapons of privilege cannot be renounced by signing a pledge or joining an organization, even this one. All of them are far too deeply ingrained in our everyday behavior. We need to recognize them and then deal with the behavior every day of our lives. Not only must we be alert to those situations in which we are tempted to use those weapons, but we must also develop the inner strength to avoid using them altogether. Force, after all, is the weapon of the weak. None of what is being advocated here is an easy task, but ultimately accomplishing it will save us all. Prophetic words written and published 25 years ago.